Hi guys, today's video is about the brief history of lesbians. It sounds like fun, but it's not. There's actually so little information and education on LGBT history and women's history in general. I certainly wasn't taught anything about either of these things in school, so I thought this video might be educational for the both of us. Buckle up. So, lesbianism or female homosexuality has been around for as long as women have. Whilst I don't have any Sapphic cave women fan fiction for you, I have gone as far back as ancient Greece, where the first records of Sapphic relations lie. It has been difficult to look at the history of lesbianism in the West with such limited sources. Back then, records were much more physical and subject to being stolen away or destroyed. Is there a dragon somewhere sat on top of a bunch of historical lesbian records? God, I hope so. It is also hard to research the history of lesbianism in the West because so much of history diminishes and ignores women, especially Native American women who were subjected to colonization, or African women brought over to the West through the brutal slave trade. So we don't know much about these women, let alone their relations to one another. Historically, people keeping accounts of lesbianism were almost always male, meaning lesbianism has been recorded almost exclusively through the male perspective. I would say this is prevalent until the 20th century, where lesbian and queer women finally began to take back their own voice and therefore their own narrative. We start then with our earliest sources from ancient Greece. Here we have references to lesbianism from poets such as Sappho and Alcman. To add to this, we also have references to lesbianism on objects such as plates and vases. That would make an interesting gift. Moving on to the Roman Empire, this is the time when lesbianism started to be depicted in a much more negative light. This coincided with the rise of the Church, which had begun to dictate a moral code to society, with the New Testament condemning female homosexuality along with male homosexuality, and other references in literature from this time which refer to lesbianism in distaste. Then we have the medieval period, a period known for its fun and light-hearted frivolity. In this time, even more literature was published condemning lesbianism and branding it unnatural. We were very cancelled back then. This literature spread all through Europe, and most of what we know about lesbianism from this period comes from court records dating back as far as 1260 about recommended punishments for lesbians. Punishments range from dismemberment to burning, but if the judge liked you, you may just get away with some good old-fashioned prison time. I told you it was fun. As well as anti-lesbian sentiment spreading through Europe, Britain was also spreading its homophobia and oppressive gender binaries through colonization of other countries. Before the British arrived in America, some Native American tribes regarded their two-spirit. Two-spirit is a modern term that some Native Americans use for their LGBT people and other spiritual identities, regarded their two-spirit people as active members of society. When the British colonies arrived, they brought with them Christianity, institutionalized homophobia, and oppressive gender binaries. And as these colonies grew, Native Americans were forced to assimilate or face shame or acts of violence. To add to this, the European Atlantic slave trade, which enslaved African people, stripped not only LGBT African people of their identities, but also of their liberty and freedom, using their labour to further Western empires. Moving on to the 18th century and the Enlightenment, it was the age of reason and logic and the emergence of tolerance. It was a spicy time, with huge social changes taking place. Lesbianism in this time was used in literature to critique the church and sell erotic novels. Of course, it still had a huge social stigma attached to it, with homophobia still rooted in Western society from the oppressive seeds the church had sown. This was a turning point, however, with no record of English courts persecuting women for lesbianism and France repealing its laws on sodomy. This brings us to the 19th century, Anne Lister, and unfortunately the dawn of conversion therapy. Conversion therapy was a practice which attempted to cure people of homosexuality. It began with medical professionals at the time deeming homosexuality as a mental illness, a notion that would carry on until the late 20th century, with remnants of that thought pattern still still happening today. The 19th century was all about strict gender roles and a mirage of respectability. What's interesting about this era is the sources we have from it, such as Anne Lister's diaries, depicting her lesbian relationships with other women in code. Whilst these diaries would not come to light until much later on, they gave us a valuable look into lesbian relationships within this period. Socio-economic factors were largely linked with a woman's freedom in this time. Moving on to the early 20th century. Now, here's where the boom really happened regarding lesbian expression in literature, film, and business. This is not to say there wasn't still a large social stigma around lesbianism in this time, but rather a breaking of the wall of silence that had surrounded it. And this was paramount in turning the tide of prejudice, and therefore opening up new conversations and ways of thinking. Moving along to LGBT history as we know it, the late 20th century brought with it political lesbianism, the Stonewall riots triggered by the violent harassment and brutality from the police towards the LGBT community, and the legalization of homosexuality in the West. There was also a boom in pornography consumption during this time. The majority of this pornography was created by men for men, contributing to both women and lesbians being displayed to a mostly male audience as consumerable products for their gratification, undoubtedly resulting in objectification and sexual harassment of both women and specifically the lesbian community. The 21st century has seen a significant change for lesbian women and their relationships, with certain countries legalizing gay marriage, gay adoption, and passing laws against LGBT discrimination. Modern representation in literature and media has made great strides in helping lesbian women take back their own narrative and change public perception of lesbians as people and their relationships. Globally, there is still a long way to go, not only for lesbian and LGBT rights, but for women's rights, with many countries still criminalizing homosexuality, with punishments sometimes as severe as death. And so, looking back, we can see how far we've come, and for many of us who live as openly gay in these free countries, it is a privilege. Whilst the road ahead to full equality is long, let us not forget the progress that we've made. Thanks for watching.